Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to be here and somehow making me nervous to have to open with the keynote this wonderful conference. Somehow, and making me nervous, you noticed with my voice, because I'm, of course, talking about Spencer Brown, that's for sure, but I'm talking about sociology as well. I'm not a mathematician, so I don't have any competence in commenting on the mathematics invented by Spencer Brown. But long ago, in the end of the 80s, we started in Bielefeld, University of Bielefeld in Germany, to read Spencer Brown's Laws of Form, given to us by Edgar Morin and some others. Niklas Luhmann, my teacher, started to read it several times. I think everybody among us has a history of doing one and a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth reading of this book in order to try to understand it. With Luhmann, you can document it very well, which is not my issue right now. I follow Luhmann in certain ways in the idea that Spencer Brown's laws of form are a wonderful instrument to look at human communication, to look at a kind of human communication which is doing both things at the same time, memorizing itself and oscillating for something new to happen. What I want to talk about now and today is a certain notion I try to introduce, which is Catjects. And I give it in 4 steps. The first step is talking about the background in looking at Spencer Brown's laws of form, talking about communication complexity, system and network, then introducing the notion of Catject, and then giving you, which will be the main part of the talk, giving you an example of how a sociologist might use Spencer Brown's laws of form to look at real human communication happening. I start with this wonderful picture taken from the laws of form themselves, page 65, edition 72. Which gives us the first impression of what we're talking about, the form of distinction. As you know, there is an appendix to the book interpreting the form of distinction in terms of logic and saying that the wonderful thing about this A and B distinguished by a cross and re-entered into the form by a re-entry is that they are about implication and negation at the same time. So what I think is quite unusual for European thinking and is quite usual for Buddhist thinking is that you have a connex between A and B, which is at the same time a separation between A and B and a combination of A and B organized by both things at the same time, implication and negation. A implies B, B implies A negates B, and B negates A, doing together a re-entry of the form into the form. Spencer Brown is developing kinds of memory and oscillation out of this kind to talk about distinction and re-entry. Of course, sociologist, when it comes into, it's a very moment when you look at the form and see that you might discover an observer and a second observer, combining their dealing with the world, so to speak. An observer doing just the first cross and talking about A, marking A, in distinction to something else, an unmarked state. A second observer looking at the first observer who is distinguishing A, the second observer discovering B as the necessary precondition, the necessary context to talk about A in the first place, and the first order observer and the second observer talking together about what kind of distinction, what kind of mark actually is to be produced at the moment when you distinguish A from B and combine A and B. Just a simple example, in sociological or even anthropological terms, you may look at human beings as the A and distinguish them from gods at the B, and you have mortal beings. You may distinguish human beings, the A, from animals, B, and you have, you think, reasonable beings. Yeah, so there is this definition of something by something else implied, and there is antonym substitution implied as well, which gives the first impression of why and how human communication is as flexible, as inventive, and as self-observing as it actually is. We may talk about sense-making in the medium of meaning. A and B and the unmarked state on the outside of the form are the medium of possible meaning. And as soon as somebody enters and looks at A and B in computer science, you talk about coarse graining your look, your perspective on the world. As soon as somebody is entering and looking at A and B among a whole range of possible meanings, you deal with sense making in the medium of meaning. There is a structural coupling of independent entities. A and B are not linked causally to each other. They may, but they don't have to. They are linked by structural coupling done by the second order observations themselves. And what I like most, perhaps most, is a quote taken from John von Neumann. There are, of course, reliable entities. Yeah? The re-entry of A and B into the form of A and B is a reliable entity from unreliable components, because when you look at it, A and B are just defined as what they are when they are taken together. What A and B are by themselves, you still don't know. They are complex, and they may be something else as soon as you combine them with something else. System and networks enter at the very time when, at the very moment, when you look again at the very same form. And as Heinz von Förster proposed, look at the re-entry of the distinction into the form as an eigenvalue of a recursive function, a mathematically recursive function, which means that as long as first-order observer and second-order observer are somehow sharing their ideas on A and B and doing what they're doing, speaking about human beings, for instance, they may continue their discourse, they may continue their communication, they may continue their talking, despite anything else chaotically and non-linearly happening. Yeah? Whatever happens in the next 2 days in this conference will be organized by the eigenvalue of talking about Spencer-Brown's laws of form in some way. Yeah? And we will experience a plethora of derivations, deviations, discourses, ideas, strange and nice and understandable and non-understandable, comprehensible and incomprehensible ideas surrounding this one eigenvalue of our communication, which is the laws of form, formerly the laws of thought, which I didn't know exactly.
Yeah. Not a lot of people
know. In sociology, you look at these eigenvalues as the eigenvalues of systems, self-referential systems. And you may use Luhmann's idea developed in Social Systems, translation published in 1995, where he is talking about the necessary temporalization of systems, conscious systems, social systems, organic systems, maybe even physical systems, nobody knows. A necessary temporalization of systems, which means that I stick with social systems, of course, any social systems we look at, for instance, a conference like that, is in a constant move of decay. Yeah? I'm talking and talking and talking and producing sentence and sentence and sentence, yet still you don't know what the next sentence will be. And still I don't know how long your patience will last in order to be able to listen to me. Yeah? I know the time, of course. Yeah? But the constant decay, which is experienced in a situation like that, difficultly, because it's a highly structured situation, highly defined by lots of ideas and traditions about conference. How should conferences happening? Yeah, conference is one of those rare places where one guy is talking, everybody else is listening. There are just 3 places in society where that kind of communication is happening: churches, universities, and conferences. so it's a highly structured, but nevertheless, you move around with your consciousness. You may leave the room. I may break down. I don't hope so. I may lose my ideas and so on. So there is a decay going on, which is answered by a constant restructuring of the situation. That's Luhmann ideas about social systems. Very useful in thinking about interaction, thinking about organizational strategies, and thinking about societies. which gives, of course, this eigenvalue of a recursive function a certain thrill to it, yeah, because sticking to it means to have to work on it, yeah, and to make sure that human beings are meant as they are meant to be meant. Another idea coming from sociology is network theory in the version Harrison C. White in his book Identity and Control gave. I just pass very, very shortly on that. He is able to talk about networks as structures of identities controlling each other in order to develop their identities, which gives me the possibility, and you will see how that will happen, the possibility to talk about A and B as a mutual control structure, A looking at B, implying and negating it, B looking at A, negating and applying it always via observers, first and second orders observers, of course, making A and B part of a network. Part of a network which only functions temporarily, as in Luhmann's system, as long as those identities stick to the network producing that identity. Finally, preliminary comments. What I think of Catjects is emerging out of this systems and network thinking about communication and complexity. Complexity, I didn't talk about that. Complexity, I take in the mathematical sense, of two entities having to come together in order for both entities being able to work, without one of these entities being reducible to the other, like in a Wurzel aus, root from -1, yeah, Wurzel aus minus 1. What? Square root of -1. Sorry, thank you. Square root of -1 is answered by -1 and +1. And -1 and +1 are referring to each other in order to produce a complex number, which means that you have two entities referring to each other in order to define complexity. And I need that, as I won't talk about today, I need that in order, for instance, to be able to talk about consciousness in relation to society, or consciousness in relation to communication. Yeah? You can never reduce communication, social communication, to consciousness, and you cannot reduce consciousness to communication, but both need each other in that nice structure of implication and negation, yeah? Such that our mental following of communication happening is always a combination of following and negating, of following and refusing, of following and diverting, of following and thinking about something else. Yeah? So consciousness and communication together define one complexity of possible catjects to be formed. So what catjects are, it's written here, they are neither subjects nor objects, which of course means that catjects is, in a somehow unmodest way, an attempt to open up old European ontological and metaphysical thinking. An ontological and metaphysical thinking which is only phrased out in terms of subjects and objects, subjects which with Kant being unconditionally underlying themselves, observers of something, objects being something standing in front of you and holding still as long as you're looking at it. So when catjects are neither subjects nor objects, are neither, let's say, entities looking at the world, nor entities in the world being looked at, they are something else. They are categories, that's where catjects comes from, categories which functionally give some structure to a organized complexity of a world described in certain terms. Yeah? For instance, the word law or the word form or a name like George or Maxwell or David or whatever, yeah, are categories, yeah, defined in some plethora of possible meanings, like George Spencer Brown said that's in Heidelberg, categories like handles, yeah, holding you by the ear, yeah, in order to make sure that you are who you are. Yeah. He said that George is my handle for you. Yeah. Don't exaggerate it. I will not be handled by you as you think you can handle me. Yeah. well, these days in Heidelberg, meant to last for half a year, last 6 days, because they were handling handles. And at a certain point, Fritz Simon had to make sure that Spencer Brown caught his airplane and went back to London at this time, because they didn't somehow find the A and B to agree upon. You know?
Can't imagine why.
Yeah. So, okay, those Catjects, well, you can read it by yourself. Those Catjects those Catjects by differentiation, A and B are differing from C and D, and by reproduction they come up again and again, are the basic of certain systems dealing with A and B, are defining a certain domain where you are doing what you are doing, are defining a certain objects you're dealing with, are defining the time you need to deal with these objects, and so on. So these Catjects help to semantically analyze and strategically navigate a complex world. Just keep in mind, Catjects are neither subjects nor objects. The whole ontology and metaphysics has to be developed at some later point of time. To make sure that you get an idea of how I'm thinking about this, I will give you just one example, which I worked with the last years, both in theory as in consulting. I did a lot of consulting work together. Janmark State is calling us.
Who signed the surrender, Andrew?
Yeah. I want to be able, as a sociologist, to talk about projects, big entrepreneurial organizations, churches, health, hospitals, universities, or whatever, in terms of categorically found, reproduced, differentiated, semantical ideas producing that very project. Producing it by means, of course, of first order and second order observers coming always together in always conflicting areas of social work, social production, social life. And I'm going into those consulting projects with 3 steps, which I like to show to you right now. The first step is giving the idea of a project as a consultant's dream. How should an enterprise, let's say a startup in our cherished Berlin startup scenery, how should it work? Well, it should define its product. This project should define its product. It should not confuse the product with the volume needed or done with this product. You have the first implication, which is at the same time a negation, saying that as soon as you change the product, you might also change the volume. Perhaps going from a niche where we're scaling to a mass market. Or changing the volume, you should also have to change the product. Yeah? So there's a necessary independency between those 2 first distinctions, the two first semantic categories defined by the crosses, which defines an interdependence you work strategically with. Those ideas or those distinctions, further distinctions enter the scenery. You have to ask for your procedure. How is the product actually done? By technical means, for instance, or we are talking a lot about family enterprises where there have to be a family combined with the product, and you cannot change the product without offending the family. So you have first to gain the family in order then to change the product, which is the business of managers in a family enterprise, for instance. You have, of course, certain positions in the product, leading positions, working positions. You have consultants, you have somebody else, a whole network of people coming together in order to do what they're doing. You have a certain style, a category coming from network theory. It would be very interesting, for instance, to analyze our conference as a project, the product being understanding laws of form, the volume being for one time at least, I want to understand it, today and tomorrow. A procedure, talking, listening, discussing, debating. Yeah? Positions, well, those people being in this room. And then style, meaning, well, we have to find out whether it's mathematics we're talking about, it's philosophical thinking we are talking about, it's certain kind of meditation, as perhaps Lou would like to say, a deep meditation going into a Buddhist structure of thinking which is completely opening up paradoxical spaces of defining things and not being able to define things. Yeah? What are the people gathering here? How are the people gathering here defined by their style? We are, of course, completely different, but something we have in common, and it would be interesting, and we need time for that. We would need time for that, to define just the style of our little and nice a project we are just finding out. Of course, we are working in some society. Now we have a vision. The project has a vision of the society. That kind of product with that kind of volume, with that kind of procedure is to be produced in the first place. A society not defined objectively, but by those first and second order observers involved in the project. Yeah, you have always to look from left to right in order to have the perspective, the vector of the observers being involved, and of course distinguished by an unmarked state which made by destiny or gods or evolution or whatever they like to think about. Yeah? A consultant stream would mean all of those variables are defined according to their value and define strategically what the project is about. What you find actually is something like that. And you see perhaps that Spencer Brown's notation is fascinating for a sociologist like me in terms of being able to draw such a form. Yeah? Here, you don't have the ideal closure of a re-entering of the whole form into the form. Yeah? You have a certain combination of crosses and re-entries, which in this kind, which is completely fictional, of course, in that case, you have a product which is defined by two crosses, just two crosses, yeah, by the cross distinguished from volume and by the cross distinguishing positions and style, which is re-entered into the variable of style, which means this project is let's say a happy niche finder, yeah, where some product is happening to be able to work, being sold or wanted by somebody else, due to a certain style by some people presenting what they are. Yeah? When we go through Liverpool, we see a lot of churches of all kinds, which might be examples for that. Yeah? Priests coming up, presenting their style of talking, presenting their style of believing, presenting their style of looking at the world, and as soon as believers are coming up, finding their product, which they continue to produce, without thinking about the volume, how big the Gemeinde, how big the community is happenstance, not thinking about the procedure. There are priests which do 20, 30 years of preaching without thinking about what they're actually doing, just serving God, without thinking about positions necessarily. Well, they discover at some time that they need somebody to open the doors of the church when they still sleep. Well, a second position for the church. Without thinking about society, if not in terms of, well, look at this sad and dismal world created by God to be surmounted by the belief in God, or something like that. Yeah? A completely, let's say, chance product of something happening by being successful. Something happening by being successful. A product out of evolution nobody thought about and nobody is able to describe, save a sociologist using Spencer Brown's notation of form. And the third step would be if somebody, and you need, with my experience, you need 1 or 2 days to do just the first 2 steps with people involved in some project. The third and last step would be, well, I just gave you an example of looking at a project. Yeah? The consultant's dream is my coming up with variables I take from industrial sociology, sociology of work, organization theory, managerial research, and lots of other things. I think for my needs of analyzing projects, helpful and even successful, but not explaining those categories, nobody would know what to look at. Yeah? You don't know what those variables mean if I don't explain them in some longer attempts to just explain them. That's why we need 1 or 2 days in order to explain them. So having understood what this analysis of second order observation of possible cat-jects means, you can start being part of a certain project, you can start to do it for yourself. Perhaps in some ideal version first, and some real version second, by asking, well, what's the first cross you're starting with? Yeah? What's really important for the project you're into? And you need, as we know, you need half a day to come up with an answer. Peter Drucker, I'm working a lot with Peter Drucker sometimes. Peter Drucker did this in some Notfallstation, emergency hall of a hospital. Yeah? He gathered together with the people doing the medical services in an emergency room, and they needed 2 days to come up with their A, which means bringing instant relief to the afflicted. Yeah? Peter Drucker asked them, what are you doing here actually? Why are you doing it in the way you're doing it? And they came up with the answer, bringing instant relief to the afflicted. Second question of Peter Drucker was, who is afflicted? Yeah, the one being to be dealt with, the patient is lying there and bleeding and almost dying. Yeah, you need time to help him, but he is surrounded by family or friends, and those are the people afflicted, which means you must help them in order that they are satisfied that the patient is in good behandlung, in good dealings. Yeah? What are hospitals doing instead? They are doing the bureaucratical gathering of form. Yeah? They ask for names and your Krankenkasse and so on. And is that helping the afflicted? No, it's making them more nervous. Yeah? So coming up with an A, bringing instant relief to the afflicted, meant for those people that first of all they had to deal with the patient himself or herself in order to make sure that the family, the afflicted, are sure that everybody is in order. Yeah? Even though nobody can do in the first moment anything helpful for this patient because the physician is still on his walk to come in and needs further 10 minutes in order to arrive. Yeah? Nevertheless, you have to do something. And the next 2 days, Peter Drucker worked with his people, meant how have you to organize the whole emergency room in order to do your A, B, C, D, E, F, and N out of this first product definition, bringing instant relief to the afflicted. And you can come up with the categories you like, which is completely depending from the empirical situation you are in. Parenthesis, what I like very much about Spencer Brown's laws of form in working sociologically is that you are obliged to do empirical work. There are only, I might say so, there are only singular instances of social situations defined by first and second order observers. Of course, there are comparisons. Hospitals are hospitals, universities are universities, enterprises are enterprises, but any hospital is different from any other hospital, any church is different from any other church, any conference is different from any other conference, and so on. There are only empirical instances of values for those variables, which makes it difficult for doing a general sociology, of course, which can just give you the form, but makes it very helpful in empirical analysis. You can add to this in order to introduce Gotthard Günther's Negativsprachen, negative languages. Yeah? You have here constantly a combination of implication and negation, which is constantly used by second order observers in saying no to first order observers in order to profile the yes. But you can draw out the negation capabilities of a project in talking about power, capital, and technology, giving you instances to systematically negate what you're doing in your project in order to strategically develop it further. And I won't go into that anymore. Just a last slide, which is still talking about management leadership, which might be understood as the positions doing not the first order and the second order observation, because that's done by all people being involved in the project, by making sure that a consultant's dream, talking about all those variables and finding values for those variables is taking place in some orderly, helpful, and strategically successful fashion. And that's it. Many thanks. This is taken from Beirut, a Beirut souk. A mosaic, of course, renovated in those modern souks developed in Beirut, but taking up motifs of very ancient ideas. Yeah. And as I must say, I have a very good friend who looked at this and said, well, don't take it for your cross. It's a Latin 50. Well, I take questions if there are any.
Could you say a word about your distinction between first order and second order observers?
Yeah. First order observers are observers who just do what they're doing, crossing a line, looking at an A, and being confident about this A. A second order observer is looking at the distinction used by the first order observer in order to look at how where is he or she coming from, what kind of context is he or she calling up in order to talk about A in the first place, and how might that A be varied by antonym substitution, by changing the context. Now the second observer is looking at the form, the first order observer is looking at the marked state, the inside of the form only. Please, and then you.
Yeah, I have one question about catjects and eigenforms. Are they the same? Is a catject an example of an eigenform? I'm just curious to hear where that falls in. Also, catject is meant to be a noun as you're using the word, or can it be a verb?
Catjecting.
And finally, it's interesting in the way that you present this, that you choose the form of the re-entry rather than, say, the electric diagram form of presenting relationships, which is more intuitive for social situations. But anyway,
well, of course, you can do a verb out of that, catjecting. Yeah. Another good friend of mine asked me, "What are those cats you are always ejecting at something?" What are they meaning to be? Well, eigenvalue, eigenforms is the mathematical term. And catject is the specification of that mathematical form for needs of semantical and sociological analysis. Yeah? Nobody ever, I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong, nobody ever thought about the relationship of eigenforms in relation to objects and subjects. Yeah? Hans-Ort Förster, for instance, is talking about recursive functions, and you're doing as well, Lou, if I'm understanding you right, talking about recursive functions as a necessary step out of this old European ontological tradition, but not, and Hans-Ort Förster is talking about the I and the subject and the objects being instances emerging out of the recursive function itself. Yeah, so there is a mathematical interpretation of subjects and objects, of course, but it's not going very deep. And when I'm trying to do to understand sociological analysis and explain it to, for instance, computer people, I have to go deeper into the distinction between objects, subjects, and catjects, and this is a level I'm on, and then I'm just using the mathematical, metaphorical, or the mathematical notions in order to explain what I'm doing. Yeah? So it's a specification. Please. You can do it together.
Jeff, I really like the application to sociology and also the archetype that you're using there. But am I supposed to take those expressions as algebraic infinite expressions? Is that?
Sorry, yes?
Am I supposed to take, if you can just bring one of them up?
Yeah, I can't.
Oh, okay. Am I supposed to take them as algebraic infinite expressions that keep repeating?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the N, which is breaking it. And when I'm going into a certain situation, talking with people, how do you define your project or whatever you want to define? I'm doing it like in structural constellation analysis, meaning I go as far into further steps of analyzing the situation as long as people are saying, well, there's something more to it. There's something more to it which is giving a certain energy to it. I'm very cautious as a sociologist talking about energy, but people is talking about energy, of course. Yeah, and they're saying, and Matthias Wager von Kiebert, for instance, is doing an analysis of that kind. They're saying as long as there is a certain energy to the situation which is not rendered by those variables we have on the flip chart, we have to go deeper into analyzing our situation. And at a certain point, in concrete empirical situations, at a certain point, people saying, well, that's it. I see my project. I discover that everything I never thought about is on the blackboard, on the flip chart, and I'm content with that. Yeah? And I'm saying, well, then you have to consider N, something you don't think about, at the very closing of what you're looking at and what you're actually living by doing your first and second order observations. Yeah? So it's an empirical halting device or halting device, and not developed theoretically and computationally. I look at 2 minutes. There's a stop I didn't see.
I think it's really good that we're going to visit the Stafford Beer archive at the end
Yeah.
because it seems to me that there's a lot of common ground between what you're trying to
I
do
hope
and
so.
applying this stuff to what Beer was doing. It'd
Yeah.
be very interesting to look at some of Beer's viable system modelling of organisations and see how it translates into your notation.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me is that certainly it's much more explicit in Beer's work that this is just a set of transductions. These are processes of transduction which are sort of coordinating meanings, creating eigenforms, if that's what, you know. The question is what's happening at the boundary. If it is a set of transductions, and I suppose that's the question, is it a set of transductions? Each of us individually in organisations create our own way of transducing the world, transducing our environment. I think in particular Gilbert Simondon, when we talk about this stuff, I don't know if you know his work, he's really interesting. I think the key is there's a politics here. There's a way that people manipulate the transductions of other people, and that creates an organizational dynamic. So it may not be quite so straight.
Yeah. I think we have to talk about this later. I think the boundary work is done by the first and the second order observers themselves. The first order and second order observers themselves. They do the boundary work. Yeah, they are doing the instructions for them. And as soon as they are complying with the conflict they are solving in the way they are working on their project, they don't know, but they do their boundary. And me as a consultant, as an external observer, not a third order observer that doesn't exist, a second observer of second order observers is coming into and looking for the N, somehow organizing the whole affair. No?
Okay, it's a long discussion.
Yeah. I think we have to, just one question.
Yeah.
Christina.
Well, I originally had two about Catjects, but maybe just one. We heard all the project example for example, we had heard these very interesting interdependencies of view, which I think comes basically the interdependencies between the variables from system theoretical insights and so on. I still cannot see that these formalisms of Spencer Brown, with these just purely syntactical form, represents in some way these very contentful interdependencies of these different variables, because they all look the same.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how can you distinguish them? They all look the same because you all only have the names.
Yeah, just one sentence. It's not me who is distinguishing it. It's the people being involved in the project who are doing the distinctions.
Yes.
As soon as they led by me, introduced by me into this kind of self-analysis, as soon as they come up with values for these variables, and as soon as they discover power plays, for instance, power plays defining why 2 months ago nobody was agreeing to scale the product into some new level, because everybody thought which kind of positions would have to be filled, how would the style change of our enterprise if we scale on a worldwide level and so on. Then they understand that they're doing themselves the work of implication and negation, and I'm completely confident with them seeing their project and starting to navigate, starting to understand how they navigated their complexity before, and may be able to strategically change the navigation after. Yeah, that is what the consultancy is about. Yeah? So there's nothing objectively being involved here. Yeah? No physics and no metaphysics, just sociological analysis of the people doing their work. Lou, last question, very last question.
This is a comment related to Christina's question. It's a mathematical comment.
Oh.
If you had been modeling using graphs, which are just ways of indicating relations among certain variables, and you can indicate any relations you like by graphical edge means that they are related, then you have a graph with cycles in it. I won't worry about directivity, but you could have directivity. Such a graph has a maximal tree, and if you take the maximal tree in the graph, you can write a laws of form expression for the tree, and then the remaining lines can be reentry lines, and you will get an expression of your type. So your type of expression is actually as universal as a graph. And the reason I say that is in answer to the look that might think that this is more special than it is.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for listening. Yeah, thank you.